Charles Burnett is a professor of history of Islamic influences in Europe at the Warbung Institute, University of London, as well as co-director of the Center for the History of Arabic Studies in Europe. His research centers on transmission of texts, techniques, and artifacts from the Arab world, including music theory and instruments, as well as music itself. The topic he's chosen today is the following: Arabic learning and the beginning of European universities. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Professor Charles Burnett.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And as you can see, I'm a historian. I'm not talking about the present-day situation, but what I think is very important about the work that I'm doing is that it shows how important Islamic knowledge, Islamic civilization was for the development of Europe in the Middle Ages, and how much, even nowadays, we are still indebted to what Europeans received from Arabic Islamic culture in the period of the Middle Ages. An enormous number of texts were translated from Arabic into Latin from the early 12th century to the mid-13th century in fields ranging over the whole of the mathematical disciplines: medicine, philosophy, and magic. This transmission took place in three areas where Christians and Muslims were in contact: in Spain, Al-Andalus, which was under Muslim rule for several centuries, in southern Italy and Sicily, and in the Middle East. All three areas were in the process of becoming Christian, under Christian control again, but the Christians inherited so much from their Muslim neighbors. Europeans were dazzled by Arabic science, both their achievements in theory, in book learning, and their technical competence, making astrolabes, tools used in medicine, clocks, machines for irrigation, and so on. An example of this fascination occurs early in the 12th century in the person of an Englishman. I think it's quite appropriate to mention an Englishman, since we're here and I'm also English, called Adelard of Bath. He was brought up at a time when young noblemen and otherwise talented youngsters received their first education from private tutors or in schools attached to cathedrals in England, and then went abroad for their further education to continental Europe, continuing to learn from scholars within cathedrals. Adelard, as a tutor to some noble young man in Bath, tells us that he was taking his student to Lyon, a notable center of learning in northeast of Paris, and he made a pact with him. He said that his nephew, as he called him, should learn the kind of things that one is taught in France to the best of his ability, whilst Adelard himself would devote himself to Arabic studies, and that they should meet a few years later and compare the results. Adelard then embarked on an intellectual journey which took him to several places in the Principality of Antioch, and which had been recently established as a result of the First Crusade, very beginning of the 12th century. And he also spent some time in Sicily, where, as I say, there's also Arabic scholarship. After 7 years, he returned to England, and there he met his nephew again, and they engaged in a kind of intellectual battle, in which Adelard espoused Arabic studies, and the nephew draws out on his French studies. Adelard characterizes Arabic studies as being new and exciting, and French studies as being traditional and boring. But the main point of contrast is that the Arabs use their brains. They use ratio in Latin, reason, whereas the French rely on authority. To quote Adelard's own words, "I have learnt one thing from my Arabic masters with reason as guide, but you another. You follow a halter," a kind of leader, being enthralled by the picture authority. For what else can authority be called other than a halter? As brute animals are led wherever one pleases by a halter, but do not know where or why they're being led, and only follow the rope by which they are pulled along, so the authority of written words leads many people into danger, since they just accept what they are told without question. So what is the point of having a brain if you do not think for yourself? If I am going to talk to you, nephew, you must give and provide rational arguments, for I am not the kind of man whom the painting on the skin, is the parchment in fact, can satisfy. Abelard is not the only person to regard the Arabs as the epitome of rational thought. His contemporary, the well-known philosopher, theologian, and lover, Peter Abelard, wrote a conversation between a Jew, a Christian, and a philosopher, in which he each explains how his beliefs can lead to happiness and personal fulfillment. Several indications show that the philosopher is a Muslim, and Abelard, in describing the emotional and intellectual turmoils of his own life, at one stage threatens to escape from his Christian enemies by running away to an Islamic country. So, for Abelard, Muslims represented both rationality and tolerance. One may note that even the King Henry II, who a few years later was responsible for the death of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, threatened that he would follow the religion of Nur ad-Din, the Zanji Sultan of Aleppo, and become a Muslim if the Pope did not depose his troublesome Archbishop. There may well have been awareness that tolerance for the people of the book, Jews and Christians, was firmly established in Quranic teaching. Tolerance towards Muslims on the part of Christians is less likely to be acknowledged, but Arabic Muslim scholars were openly respected for their scientific and philosophical talent and their willingness to innovate. John of Salisbury, one of the leading intellectuals of his time in the mid-12th century, credits the Muslims as being the only people to understand geometry, which they pursued for the sake of astronomy, for making observations of the stars. One may quote another anecdote by a scholar of the generation after Abelard, another Englishman, Daniel of Morley, who tells us that, like many scholars, I've already mentioned this, he left England with the intention of studying at the University of Paris. The university now was taking over from the cathedral schools. But he found that the professors there were more like donkeys than men. They spent their time engaged in minutiae and had no interest in science. But then he heard that Arabic learning, concentrating on the mathematical sciences, was flourishing in Toledo, the new capital of Spain after the Reconquest, and that it was possible to study there. So he hastened to Toledo and was not disappointed. He studied both the greatest of the translators of Arabic science and philosophy. He studied with Gerard of Cremona and with his Arabic colleague, someone called Ghalib, a Christian from Al-Andalus. This allowed him to write a book about how the universe functioned, in which he begs his readers to accept, I quote, simple and clear opinions of the Arabs, rather than the obscure statements of Latin scientists who veil their ignorance under a blanket of unintelligibility. Latin scholars were spurred into doing something about the fact that Arabic learning was superior to their own. Abelard himself translated from Arabic a program of mathematical learning, starting with geometry, progressing possibly through spherical geometry, but certainly to the astronomical tables of the Arabic mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, along with their instructions, which led naturally to dealing with applied astronomy, i.e. scientific astrology and astrological magic. Moreover, he described in his own words how to use an astrolabe, this very sophisticated instrument for measuring the heavens invented by the Arabs. We have good reasons to believe that Abelard had some connections with the best-known cathedral school at the time, that of Chartres, some 50 miles southwest of Paris. For early in the 1140s, the chancellor there, Thierry, who was responsible for the teaching in the school, compiled a comprehensive 2-volume collection of the essential texts for studying the 7 liberal arts, the arts and the sciences of the time. And he included in it Adelard's translation of Euclid's geometry, translation from Arabic, and his astronomical tables for measuring the positions of the stars and planets. Moreover, he clearly encouraged other scholars to translate works. For Hermann of Carinthia, who caused Thierry his teacher, proposed to him a curriculum in astronomy and astrology consisting of works that he and his colleague Robert of Ketton had already translated or planned to translate. And incidentally, Herman and Robert were responsible for translating the first corpus of Islamic literature, including the Quran, into Latin, and these were very good translations which gave the West a very clear idea of Islamic belief. The most comprehensive program of translation is that which took place in Toledo in the second half of the 12th century. Here, Dominicus Gundisalinus, an archdeacon resident in the cathedral, who died after 1190, and Gerard of Cremona, nicknamed the Master because he was such an intelligent man, who died in 1187, undertook the translation of texts on psychology and metaphysics, on logic, geometry, natural science, astronomy, and medicine. Both translators made their own versions of a very significant Arabic text concerning the range of the sciences. Al-Farabi on the classification of the sciences. Here Al-Farabi, who lived in Baghdad in the 9th century, though, as you can see from his name, he was a Persian, but writing in Arabic, described the nature and the divisions of logic, mathematics, natural science, metaphysics, and the social sciences, politics, law, and rhetoric, and recommended textbooks, largely by the Greek philosopher Aristotle, for the individual divisions. Al-Farabi's book provided a program, a kind of template, for the Toledan translators to follow, and we see them completing this program over a period of roughly a century, from the middle of the 12th century to the middle of the 13th century. The Western translators were, in the first place, aiming to restore ancient learning of Euclid, Ptolemy, Aristotle, and Galen, that is, geometry, astronomy, philosophy, and medicine, which they were aware survived among both the Greeks in the Byzantine Empire and the Arabs. Thus, they had two possible sources for writing, for translating these works, which were, as I shall explain, to become the set texts of the early universities. And they could find copies of most of these texts in Greek, just as scholars in Baghdad had done in the 9th century when they translated them from Greek into Arabic, sometimes via Syriac. But among the Arabs, the Latins could and did find more than the texts. They found teachers. And they were confronted with the results of a tradition of scholarship which had not only absorbed new elements from other cultures, particularly from India and Persia, but had also developed, refined, and changed the learning of the ancients. Thus, the astronomical models of Ptolemy contended with those of Indian astronomers, and his measurements of the movements of the planets were repeatedly corrected and often replaced ever since the official testing or observations sponsored by the Caliph al-Ma'mun in the early 9th century. Aristotle's works on physics, together with the ancient commentaries on them, were transmitted, but Al-Farabi, Ibn Barajar, Ibn Rushd wrote new commentaries, and Avicenna, Ibn Sina, recast the whole of Aristotle's philosophy in a new, up-to-date form, taking into account the latest discoveries in medicine and the human physiology. Perhaps even more radical was the replacement, indeed, of the original works of Galen by new texts on medicine, each generation of Arabic doctors trying to outdo the work of his predecessor. Adelard of Bath and Stephen the philosopher both refer to their Arabic teachers, magistri, which they encountered in the Principality of Antioch. Other translators benefited from the diaspora of Jewish scholars who had cultivated Arabic learning, living under Arabic rule, Islamic rule, following the expulsion of the Jews from Islamic Spain by the Almohads in 1160. In some cases, the translators appear to have used those scientific works promoted by their Arabic reading masters. For example, Constantine the African, who came from Kairouan in present-day Tunisia, transmitted the medical traditions of his masters there, and Gundisalinus, the archdeacon of Toledo, translated Avicenna Al-Ghazali, Avicebron, and authors favored by his Jewish collaborator, Abraham ibn Daud. Also translating the greatest of the works of Avicenna, his Canon of Medicine, which became the standard text for the teaching of medicine in the Middle Ages right through to the 17th century. This massive movement of translation lasted approximately from the early 12th century until the mid-13th century. Just as the new translations of Adelard at the beginning of this period had enriched the library of the Cathedral of Chartres, so the translations of texts and commentaries at Toledo and in the south of Italy and Sicily became the set texts on the curricula of the new universities which were being set up in the late 12th century in Paris, Bologna, Oxford, and Cambridge, and in the schools of medicine. Thank you very much. We can trace this development through the 12th and 13th century in regard to natural science or philosophy, the study of the universe from natural principles governing the universe, that is physics, through to the nature of minerals, plants, and animals, and through to man, and leading eventually to the study of first principles, the first cause, the nature of God, which we call metaphysics. The systematic study of the universe was a new subject in Western philosophy and was based on the works of Aristotle. These were successively recovered from Greek and Arabic. Aristotle, of course, translated into Arabic. From the 12th century, the early 12th century onwards, in Greek the translations took place in different places and for different reasons, in Venice, Antioch, Pisa, Catania, and Sicily, and until the 13th century when William of Murbacher revised the whole corpus and filled in the gaps. A more systematic translation of Aristotle's works took place in Toledo with Gerard of Cremona, following the program of Al-Farabi, starting from the first works of Aristotle on natural science, and was continued by Alfred of Shareshill, another Englishman, and by Michael Scott, indeed a Scotsman, who transferred from Toledo to the court of Frederick II in Palermo, and who finished, as it were, this particular task of translating the works of Aristotle on the natural sciences from Arabic. The early 13th century collection on natural science and metaphysics came to be known as the Corpus Vetustius, the older corpus, because in the late 13th century it was progressively replaced by a new corpus known as the more recent corpus, the Corpus Recentius, in which the translations of Aristotle from Arabic were replaced by translations from Greek. And many of the older Greek translations were revised, largely by William of Murbacher, whom I've already mentioned, who died in 1286. But both manuscripts of the Corpus Vetustius and those of the Corpus Recentius were copied for the university students in Oxford, Cambridge, Paris, Padua, Bologna, Salamanca, etc. And so we have a massive number of copies of these works. The new translations were made partly in response to controversies regarding the authenticity of doctrines attributed to Aristotle and their compatibility with Christianity. This was a debate which went on throughout the 13th century, with periodic interdictions of the teaching of particular works of Aristotle or particular doctrines, until in 1277 there was a kind of great inquisition of all the doctrines of Aristotle, but Aristotle won out and remained the standard at the core of university teaching. But while the translations became largely those from Greek and the Arabic translations of Aristotle were displaced, the commentaries were Arabic. The same Michael Scott, who translated Aristotle's book on animals, was responsible for the translation of several large commentaries by Ibn Rushd, Averroes, who died in 1198, on natural science and metaphysics. Theodore of Antioch was asked by the students of Padua University to translate Averroes' preface to his large commentary on the physics, which gave an account of his scientific method. In the printing of a magnificent collection of, I quote, all the works of Aristotle and all the commentaries of Averroes of Cordova on these works that have come down to us, we find that there are 11 volumes absolutely crammed full of works by Averroes in Latin translation. This was printed in 1550 to in 1552. To sum up, it is no coincidence that the period of translations from Arabic into Latin coincided at its height with that of the establishment of the first universities in Europe. We can see the translations being sent or brought from the places where they were made, the valley of the Ebro in northeast Spain, Toledo, Naples, Antioch, first to the cathedral and monastic schools, and eventually to the cities in which the universities were developed. I've already named these: Paris, Oxford, Salamanca, Montpellier for a school of medicine, Padua, etc. In arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and medicine, and the interpretation of Aristotle's natural sciences and metaphysics, Arabic authorities remained supreme. They were not regarded as being exotic or belonging to another culture, but rather as being the true inheritors of ancient wisdom, the wisdom of the Greeks and the Romans. Their texts were part of the fabric of Western learning. We have a truly Mediterranean culture here, which indeed embraces the Jews as well. The translations in turn generated commentaries, adaptations, and summaries by Latin writers, but the source was not forgotten. As late as 1642, John Selden, an Oxford English legal historian, Hebraist, and Arabist, was able to write, I quote, "The liberal and correctly taught sciences were formerly, for a long time, called by us the English, the studies of the Arabs, as if called after the race and the places where they were then alone seriously cultivated. This is clear," Selden continues, "from Adelard's preface to his Natural Questions, which he wrote when bringing the sciences back to England from the schools of the Arabs." Thank you very much.
I really enjoyed it and talk about Islam, about the foundation of Islam, about the contribution of Islam to the world, and the history, what I saw, you believe, what I saw, the way which you said it, like a film, it brought the history to me.
Yeah, well.
To the end, that was my, of course, you're a professor, you know what you're doing. I have a daughter, but she's in the Oxford University. She's doing a PhD on Arabic, and of course she's lecturing there as well. Lecturing there. And what I would like to see at the moment, if we give it to the floor, see if ladies and gentlemen want to ask a question. Should we wait to someone else?
After you. I can see that we should be grateful.
We should be grateful, yes, 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 yes.
Especially maths. That's good.
Yes.
Professor Akbar Ahmed came here
Oh, yes.
about two years ago.
Yes.
And he was wonderful in expressing his interest in Islam around Europe. And he went on a tour. And this is one of the stops. And I think he's making a book. Do you know each other or communicate with each other?
Yes.
Yes.
I can't say he's a friend, but I admire the work he's doing. Yes.
I think the book is being finalized, or I'm not sure if it's launched just yet. But how about yourself? What texts have you written?
A small book called The Introduction of Arabic Learning into England.
I see.
Yes, which was originally a series of 3 lectures at the British Library, so the Panizza lectures. But otherwise, mainly what I do is I edit a lot of these texts which were translated, usually in collaboration with an Arabic scholar. So we edit the Arabic text, and we edit the Latin translation, and you can see just in in what form the Arabic learning was brought over into Europe, whether the Latin translator understood exactly what he was reading and translating. Often this Latin translator would actually make glosses or notes to explain difficult passages, or his students and followers would write a commentary, again basing themselves on this Latin translation. What is maybe sounds a little bit strange to us now is that people didn't try to learn the original languages. They thought that if you had a literal translation, that would give you all you needed. In fact, there's a famous letter concerning the Greek Latin translations, saying that making a translation is like putting clean new clothes on. You're clothing the ancient science in a beautiful way, and then you can throw the old clothes away, after doing that. So the important thing is to have this knowledge in Latin. Maybe have more than one translation. Very often there were 2 or 3 translations of the same work, and you can compare the two and get to the truth. What was referred to as in Latin as the Arabica veritas, the Arabic truth, by comparing translations. Or by, as I suggest, what's happening in Spain, southern Italy, Sicily, and the Middle East. Or you would have an Arabic scholar, not necessarily a Muslim, he could be an Arabic Christian, Arabic-speaking Christian, or a Jew, beside you, who was helping you to understand the text. We have evidence of what we call translation by 4 hands. The Christian translator who put the text into good Latin, but his interpreter who would perhaps be communicating with him in a vernacular language, in medieval Spanish or medieval Italian, or even the spoken Arabic of each of these areas.
Yes, that's reminded me of the Prof. Salim. You know Prof. Salim 1001?
Yeah,
He's a very close friend.
I work with him, yes.
Excellent.
Yes.
And any more questions? Please put your hand together for the Thank you very much.